I've got a story for you today that's going to make you question everything you think you know about your neighbors. So imagine you're Karen Mitchell. You're a suburban mom. You've just moved to this quiet little town called Millbrook, Indiana. You need to get your car inspected, and everyone tells you there's this mechanic. Older guy, keeps to himself, but he's good at what he does. So you drive over to his shop, and something feels off. He's taking way too many pictures of your car. He's asking personal questions. And then get this, he somehow knows your SUV used to be a government vehicle just by looking at it. You're freaked out. You call 911. You report suspicious activity. And then the FBI shows up. Now, here's where this story gets absolutely wild. Because the man Karen thought was a threat. He wasn't just innocent. He was something else entirely. And what happens next is going to blow your mind. This is the story of Thomas Richter and how a routine car inspection nearly got a war hero killed. Thomas Richter checked the 3 locks on his shop door every morning at 5:47 a.m. Deadbolt first, then the chain, finally the doorknob lock. Each one turned with the same deliberate precision he'd once used to disarm devices that could vaporize city blocks. But the people of Millbrook didn't know that. They saw only a gruff 68-year-old man who kept to himself and worked with uncomfortable intensity. The shop was immaculate. Tools arranged by size and function, parts labeled and cataloged, not a single wrench out of place. His father's philosophy had kept Tom alive in Afghanistan. Here in Millbrook, it just made him seem obsessive. He measured out exactly 3 scoops of coffee grounds and walked the perimeter of his shop, checking windows and noting the 3 cars parked outside. Mrs. Henderson's blue Civic sat in its usual spot. Pete Morrison's pickup truck was slightly closer to the street than usual, and a silver SUV he didn't recognize, Indiana plates, parked directly across from his front door. Tom pulled out a small notebook and jotted down the SUV's license plate number, make and model. He'd been logging every unfamiliar vehicle for 3 years. Agent Chen had insisted on it after the 3rd death threat. To anyone watching, it would look like surveillance. Tom's right hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. Nerve damage from prolonged exposure to explosive concussions. The doctors called it nerve damage. Tom called it a reminder. The bell chimed at exactly 8:15 a.m. The woman was mid-40s, aggressively suburban, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail tight enough to serve as a facelift. She clutched a designer purse like it contained state secrets. Karen Mitchell, recently moved from Indianapolis, needing her car inspected. The DMV had told her he was the only certified inspector in town. Tom noticed she kept glancing at the exits. Most people did that when they were nervous or lying. In his experience, nervous people were usually lying about something. Her grip was firm when they shook hands, but her palm was damp. The SUV was pristine. Barely 10,000 miles on it. Tom began his inspection with methodical thoroughness, checking oil, examining belts, testing battery connections. Everything by the book, just like he'd been taught to clear a building or examine a potential explosive device. Karen watched him work, growing uncomfortable. Tom photographed the VIN number. Standard procedure, but then she noticed him taking additional photos of the interior, undercarriage, even the spare tire compartment. His examination seemed less like routine inspection and more like intelligence gathering. When he knelt to examine the undercarriage, she saw him run his fingers along the frame in a practiced, methodical way, like he was checking for bombs or tracking devices. Tom noted the government fleet maintenance sticker partially scraped off the inside of the driver's door. He'd learned to spot such things during his time in witness protection, details that could mean the difference between safety and a bullet in the back of the head. The federal contract number was still visible. Karen's face flushed when he pointed this out. She insisted she'd bought it from a dealer, and knew nothing about that. Tom pulled out his notebook again, claiming he needed to note it for the inspection. But Karen could see he was recording more than standard notes. the federal contract number, dealer information, even her last oil change date. 20 minutes later, he handed Karen her inspection certificate. She snatched it and headed for her car. Tom watched her pull out her phone immediately, gesturing animatedly as she spoke, pointing back at his shop. 3 blocks away, Karen Mitchell sat in her SUV with shaking hands, reporting suspicious activity to 911. She described a mechanic who took pictures of her car, knew it was a government vehicle just by looking, and asked personal questions about her job and family. He kept detailed records of everyone, had written down her license plate before she'd even gotten out. The dispatcher promised to send an officer to check it out, unaware that this report would shatter Tom's carefully constructed quiet life forever. Officer Jake Morrison had been patrolling Millbrook for 3 years, and in that time, the most exciting thing he dealt with was a break-in at the hardware store that turned out to be a raccoon. So when dispatch called about suspicious activity at Richter's Auto Repair, Jake felt a familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with skepticism. A solid investigation of potential terrorist activity, even if it turned out to be nothing, would look good on his record. Tom was underneath the Ford when he heard the police cruiser's engine. He'd been expecting this since Karen's phone call, but that didn't make it any less concerning. He slid out from under the car and wiped his hands on his coveralls, watching through the window as a young officer approached his shop. The bell chimed as Officer Morrison entered, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. He introduced himself and explained that he wanted to ask about an incident earlier that day. A customer had complained about suspicious behavior during a routine car inspection, excessive photographs, personal questions beyond what was normal for the service. Tom explained that he'd photographed the VIN number and documented the inspection, same as always. As for questions, he'd asked what any mechanic would ask about a vehicle's history. Morrison pulled out his notebook and mentioned that the customer had said Tom immediately identified her car as a former government vehicle. She'd found that unusual. Tom pointed out that the maintenance sticker was still partially visible. Anyone who works on cars would notice. But Morrison pressed further, noting that she'd said Tom asked about her employment, family, and travel history. That seemed beyond the scope of a car inspection. Tom maintained that he'd asked if she'd had any work done recently, if she'd driven it long distances, if there were any issues he should know about. Standard questions. Morrison wrote this down, but his body language suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. When Morrison asked where Tom had learned to identify government vehicles so quickly, Tom simply said, experience. The kind that comes from working on cars for a long time. Morrison's patience was wearing thin. Tom's answers were technically responsive, but revealed nothing. Morrison requested identification, examining Tom's driver's license carefully. It showed he was from Ohio originally, but he'd moved here from around. When pressed for specifics, Tom hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Morrison to notice. He'd lived in a few places, he said. He'd moved around the country for work. Morrison's frustration grew with each non-answer. Tom's military training kicked in. Don't volunteer information. Don't elaborate. Don't create vulnerabilities. When Morrison asked to see his business records, Tom declined without a warrant. Morrison's face flushed at the refusal. The two men stared at each other. Morrison young, eager, and frustrated by Tom's stonewalling. Tom calm, experienced, and absolutely determined not to compromise his cover. Morrison warned that this wasn't over before leaving. After Morrison left, Tom stood in his empty shop, listening to the sound of the police cruiser driving away. He pulled out his secure phone and called Agent Chen, reporting that they had a problem. The kind that starts with suspicious neighbors and ends with blown covers. Through his window, Tom watched small groups of people gathering on the sidewalk, all staring at his shop. Karen Mitchell's SUV was parked across the street, the woman behind the wheel talking animatedly on her phone, occasionally pointing at his shop. Whatever she was saying it to multiple people. Tom had learned to recognize the signs of an operation going sideways. The isolated target, the mounting suspicion, the gradual tightening of the noose. As he watched more cars pull up outside, and more people gather to stare at his shop, Tom realized that maybe his carefully constructed quiet life was already over. By 6 o'clock that evening, half of Millbrook knew about the suspicious mechanic and his confrontation with Officer Morrison. The other half would know by morning. Karen Mitchell had started with a phone call to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived in Millbrook for 30 years and knew everyone worth knowing. Within an hour, the story had spread through the volunteer fire department, the church ladies' auxiliary, and the Tuesday night book club. Each retelling added new details, most of them invented, but all of them damning. The story that emerged bore little resemblance to the truth. Tom Richter had become a mysterious drifter with possible terrorist connections, who'd been casing the town for months, gathering intelligence on government workers and local law enforcement. The fact that he'd refused to cooperate with police questioning was proof of his guilt. Frank Kowalski heard the rumors at Murphy's Diner during the evening rush. He'd been coming to the diner for 15 years, ever since his wife passed, and he'd never seen the regulars so worked up about anything. When he defended Tom as a good man who minded his own business, he was quickly outshouted. The consensus was clear. Tom Richter was a threat to the community, and something needed to be done about it. 3 blocks away, Tom was closing up his shop when he noticed the pickup truck parked across the street. The driver was trying to be subtle, but Tom had been trained to spot surveillance. This was the 3rd vehicle he'd seen in the past hour. Different cars, different people, but all of them watching his shop. He finished his evening routine with added precautions, checking locks on all windows, testing the alarm system, and making sure his emergency bag was packed and ready. Tom had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, they were telling him that Millbrook was no longer safe. The first sign of real trouble came at 11:30 p.m. Tom was reviewing his customer files when he heard the sound of breaking glass. 3 teenagers were standing by his truck, one holding a baseball bat. They'd smashed his driver's side window and were spray-painting terrorist across the side of his vehicle. Tom's first instinct was to confront them, but his training overrode his anger. Confronting teenagers would only escalate the situation and give the community more evidence of his dangerous nature. Instead, he watched from the shadows, memorizing their faces. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Chief Robert Hayes arrived at the shop to find Tom sweeping up glass from the parking lot. Hayes was a 20-year veteran, old enough to remember when police work was about protecting people rather than managing public relations nightmares. When Hayes asked about pressing charges, Tom declined. Most people would be upset about vandalism, demanding justice, and talking about hate crimes. But Tom wasn't most people. Hayes briefed him about Officer Morrison's suspicions, then offered his own observation. Tom was a man who valued privacy, but his situation would get worse before it got better. Hayes had been police chief for 8 years. He knew how the town worked. Right now, Tom was the mysterious outsider who wouldn't answer questions. Tomorrow, he'd be the dangerous drifter planning something terrible. By next week, he'd be the confirmed terrorist who needed to be driven out of town. Hayes suggested Tom tell him where he was really from. Give him something to calm people down. Tom offered only that he was from Ohio, had moved here 3 years ago to start over, and kept to himself because he preferred it that way. Hayes said it wasn't enough, but it was all Tom could give. After the chief left, Tom called Agent Chen again, reporting that the situation was deteriorating. She could have him out in 6 hours, but Tom requested another day. He looked around his shop at the tools he'd carefully arranged, the customers' cars waiting for repair, the small life he'd built from nothing. But even as he asked for more time, Tom could see Karen Mitchell's SUV parked across the street again. She was talking to someone on her phone, gesturing toward his shop. Whatever she was planning, it was bigger than vandalism. Tom had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan and 3 years in hiding. He'd defused bombs that could level city blocks and faced down enemies who wanted him dead. But he'd never faced anything quite like the righteous anger of a small American town, convinced that he was the enemy. Maya Santos had been waiting for a story like this her entire career. As the crime reporter for the Millbrook Gazette, she'd spent 2 years covering minor thefts and domestic disputes. But the tip about a potential terrorist investigation sent electricity through her veins. By dawn, she was parked across from Richter's Auto Repair, studying the spray-painted terrorist on the building's side and noting how the windows were positioned like someone who understood surveillance. The interviews came easily. Karen Mitchell had spent the night organizing her neighbors, and they were ready to talk. Each conversation revealed new layers of suspicion about the mysterious mechanic who paid only in cash, received no mail, and seemed to know too much about government operations. Mrs. Henderson mentioned his probing questions about her driving habits and family connections. Bob Fletcher described Tom's late-night walks around town with a notebook. Everyone agreed that normal people didn't live like they were preparing for war. Maya's article wrote itself. She crafted the piece carefully, avoiding direct accusations while building an unmistakable narrative of danger. The headline read, "Who is the mysterious mechanic?" and the subtext was clear. Thomas Richter posed a threat to small-town America. When she approached Tom for comment, his flat refusal to engage only strengthened the story's impact. The article hit the Gazette's front page like a match to kindling. Within hours, regional news outlets had picked up the story. By afternoon, social media was buzzing with the hashtag Millbrook Mystery. Tom's photograph spread across Facebook, generating increasingly wild theories about his true identity and purpose. The media attention brought immediate consequences. News vans began arriving in Millbrook, their crews eager to interview locals about the suspicious mechanic. The story perfectly matched the current news cycle's appetite for domestic terrorism fears. Television reporters stood outside Tom's shop, describing him as a mysterious outsider whose behavior had alarmed an entire community. Tom watched the circus from his window, recognizing the dangerous momentum building around him. He'd seen this pattern before in Afghanistan, how quickly rumors could spiral into mob violence, how the need for someone to blame could override reason and decency. His worst fears materialized when Agent Chen called. The news coverage had gone national. Tom's photograph was now visible to anyone with internet access, including the terrorist networks that had sworn to kill him. Khalil Ahmad, the cell leader from Afghanistan, had connections throughout the Middle East and sleeper cells in America. If he saw Tom's face on the news, the mechanic's carefully constructed cover would become a death sentence. The timeline had collapsed from months to hours. Agent Chen could extract him immediately. But Tom stared at his shop, at the tools arranged with such precision, at the customers' cars waiting for repair, at the small life he'd built from nothing. These people thought he was their enemy, but they had no idea that real enemies might soon come looking for him. Tom faced an impossible choice: disappear and leave the town vulnerable to retaliation, or stay and protect people who wanted him gone. Outside, the news crews prepared for their evening broadcasts, unknowingly turning Millbrook into a target that would soon attract the attention of America's most dangerous enemies. Frank Kowalski had been having the same nightmare for 47 years. But tonight it was different. Instead of his friend Jimmy stepping on that mine in Korea, it was Tom Richter in the muddy hole, and Frank was the one who couldn't reach him in time. He woke at 4 a.m., drenched in sweat, Tom's cryptic warning about war zones echoing in his mind. That flat, matter-of-fact tone was unmistakable, the way soldiers spoke when they knew death was coming. By dawn, FBI agents had arrived at the town hall. The questioning lasted 2 hours in the same conference room, where the city council discussed potholes and snow removal. Tom answered what he could, and refused what he couldn't, his military bearing intact, despite the mounting pressure. When pressed about his contact with Agent Chen, he simply stated he couldn't discuss classified matters. The agents grew increasingly frustrated, but Tom had survived worse interrogations. The crowd waiting outside was larger than before. Reporters thrust microphones forward, while protesters held signs reading "Terrorist, go home and protect our children." Karen Mitchell positioned herself by Tom's truck, her face flushed with righteous anger. When she accused him of being a threat to decent people, Tom's exhaustion finally showed. His warning about real threats coming to town was recorded on multiple phones, creating another viral moment that would haunt him. The vandalism had escalated. Red paint covered his shop windows, and "Murderer" was spray-painted across the roll-up door. Tom cleaned it mechanically, feeling the weight of the town's hatred pressing down on him. For 3 years, he'd tried to build a quiet life here, fixing cars and paying taxes. He'd even started to think he might belong somewhere again. Agent Chen's call shattered that illusion. Their informant in Detroit had picked up chatter. Someone with connections to Khalil Ahmad was asking questions about Tom. The timeline had collapsed to 48 hours or less. The extraction order was immediate and non-negotiable. Tom stared around his shop at the tools arranged with such care, at the calendar marked with appointments he'd never keep. When he asked about protecting the town, Chen reminded him these people had called him a terrorist. They wanted him gone. But Tom knew they were just scared, acting on fear rather than facts. The news was evolving dangerously. Maya Santos reported that sources within the FBI suggested Tom's presence might be part of a larger federal investigation. The story was getting closer to the truth with each broadcast. Soon, someone would put the pieces together, and the whole charade would collapse. Tom's call to Deputy Director Webb confirmed his worst fears. The government prioritized plausible deniability over civilian protection. Extraction would confirm his federal connection, so they preferred to maintain the fiction that he was just a suspicious mechanic. Webb's refusal to authorize protection for Millbrook forced Tom to make an impossible choice. His apartment above the shop felt like a tomb as he packed his essentials. Everything else would stay behind. 3 years of careful life-building reduced to a single duffel bag. But as he folded his clothes, he kept thinking about Frank's nightmares, about how fear could transform good people into a mob, about the weight of responsibility that came with classified knowledge. Outside, the protest had transformed into a candlelit vigil. Someone had brought a guitar, and voices carried hymns through the night air. They were singing as if holding a funeral for their town's innocence, unaware that real danger was approaching. Tom pulled out pen and paper and began writing letters to Frank, to Chief Hayes, to Maya Santos, even to Karen Mitchell. Letters that would explain everything, that would warn them what was coming, that would give them a chance to save themselves. Letters he might never have the courage to send. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. Tomorrow he would have to choose between his own safety and the lives of people who thought he was their enemy. He thought about Senator Bradley's son, about the 12 other soldiers whose lives he'd saved by defusing that bomb in Afghanistan. He thought about the price of heroism and the cost of doing what was right. If the government wouldn't protect Millbrook, then Tom Richter would have to find another way. The question was whether he could save them from the storm he'd brought to their door, or whether innocence was already dead in this small American town killed the moment he'd arrived seeking refuge. The emergency town meeting was called for 7 p.m. on a Thursday night, but by 6:30 the Millbrook Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Karen Mitchell had spent the day organizing what she called a reckoning, and the folding chairs were filled with worried faces while people stood along the walls, their voices creating a low hum of anxiety and anger. Karen rose from the front row, her posture rigid with righteous determination. She pulled out a manila folder and began reading her documented evidence, photographed license plates, probing questions about military deployments, counter-surveillance activities around the town perimeter. With each accusation, the crowd grew more agitated. Someone shouted from the back, demanding to know why Tom was still there. Tom Richter sat in the last row, his back to the wall, watching the proceedings with the detached calm of someone who'd seen mob justice before. He'd almost stayed away, but something had compelled him to come. Maybe the need to see how fear could transform ordinary people into something ugly. Karen's voice rose with emotion as she delivered her final accusation. Tom was either a government operative conducting illegal surveillance on American citizens, or a terrorist communicating with his handlers. Either way, he had no business being in their community. Chief Hayes stood reluctantly, explaining that Tom had broken no provable laws, and the FBI had found no evidence of terrorist activity. But the crowd was beyond listening to authority. Questions came faster now, overlapping and building on each other until the room buzzed with barely contained anger. Tom watched faces he recognized, customers whose cars he'd fixed, neighbors who'd nodded politely when they passed on the street. Maya Santos sensed the story reaching its climax and asked Tom to respond to the accusations. The room fell silent as every eye turned to him. He sat perfectly still for a long moment before rising slowly to his feet, looking older than his 68 years, weathered by secrets and the weight of protecting people who wanted to destroy him. Tom's response was simple. He fixed cars, had never hurt anyone in town, and had tried to live quietly. But Karen pressed for real answers about his federal connections. The crowd sensed his evasion and demanded more. Tom looked around the room, at faces twisted with suspicion and fear, thinking about the letters he'd written but never sent, about the warnings he couldn't give. His explanation was carefully measured. 26 years of military service, doing things that needed doing in places they'd never hear about, coming to Millbrook seeking peace. But when pressed about the federal agents, his cryptic response about some things following you home only inflamed the crowd further. The breaking point came when Tom finally revealed the truth. He'd saved lives, and because of that, others wanted to take his. The federal agents weren't his handlers, but his protection from people who would turn the town into a war zone if they knew where to find him. The room erupted in chaos. Frank Kowalski tried to defend Tom, shouting about fair prices and helping elderly neighbors, but his words were lost in the renewed anger. The crowd was feeding on its own fear now, beyond reason or restraint, chanting for Tom's exile. Tom walked toward the front of the room as the crowd gradually quieted. Sensing something significant was about to happen, he reached the podium and looked out at faces that had become a jury ready to render judgment. His acceptance of their demand was laden with warning. When the truth came out, he wanted them to remember they'd chosen fear over trust, cruelty over decency. But Karen demanded the full truth, and Tom's careful composure finally slipped. He revealed the complete picture: men who wanted to kill him for serving his country, the danger his presence brought to everyone in town, his failed attempts to leave because he'd started caring about people who saw him as a monster. He'd been living under a false name to keep them safe, not to hurt them. His final warning was stark. Tomorrow morning he'd be gone, and the protection would leave with him. He hoped they were right about him being the threat, because if they were wrong, they were about to discover what a real threat looked like. Tom walked out into the cool night air, leaving behind a room full of people who were just beginning to understand they might have made a terrible mistake. In the parking lot, he made the call that would change everything, telling Agent Chen it was time to come in. He didn't notice the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the man inside photographing everyone who entered and left the community center. By morning, those photographs would be in the hands of people who had been searching for Tom Richter for 3 years, and the quiet town of Millbrook would become exactly what he'd warned them it would become: a war zone. The rumble started low, vibrating through the ground as people filed out of the community center, their voices hushed with the uncomfortable aftermath of mob judgment. 7 black vehicles appeared at the far end of Main Street, moving in perfect formation through the quiet town: massive armored SUVs, a communications van, and support vehicles that transformed Millbrook's sleepy streets into something from a federal operation. Karen Mitchell, still clutching her folder of accusations, stopped on the community center steps and stared. The crowd that had been so vocal minutes earlier fell into stunned silence as doors opened simultaneously and men and women in dark suits emerged, their movements coordinated with military precision. Deputy Director Marcus Webb stepped from the lead vehicle, his silver hair catching the streetlight, his presence commanding immediate attention. Agent Sarah Chen followed, her face grim with purpose. Webb surveyed the crowd with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations, then called out for Thomas Richter. The crowd turned as one toward Tom, who stood frozen by his truck, his keys still in his hand. As he walked slowly toward the convoy, the crowd parted, their earlier anger replaced by confusion and growing dread. When Webb extended his hand and addressed him as Sergeant Major Richter, the title hung in the air like a revelation. The truth unfolded in devastating waves. Tom wasn't a terrorist or government spy. He was a decorated soldier living under federal protection. Khalil Ahmad, the terrorist leader whose cell had been hunting him for 3 years, had sworn a blood oath to kill the man who had prevented a massacre that would have claimed a senator's son and 11 other soldiers. The suspicious behavior Karen had documented wasn't espionage, it was operational security for a man living with a death sentence. Webb's words fell like hammer blows on the crowd's collective conscience. Tom had insisted on staying in Millbrook when he could have been relocated anywhere, finding purpose in fixing cars and helping neighbors who saw him as a monster. The federal agents weren't his handlers but his lifeline, and instead of gratitude, The town had given him 3 years of suspicion, culminating in tonight's public humiliation. The revelation of Tom's true identity. An explosive ordnance disposal specialist who had saved lives by disarming sophisticated bombs, transformed the crowd's understanding entirely. Karen's folder slipped from nerveless fingers as she realized the magnitude of their mistake. The article Maya Santos had written, meant to expose a perceived threat, had actually accelerated the timeline of real terrorists closing in on their location. But then came the final twist. Khalil Ahmad was dead, killed in a drone strike, along with most of his network. The hunt was over. The threat that had defined Tom's existence for 3 years had been neutralized 3 days ago. As Agent Chen presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, the crowd began to understand what kind of man they had been trying to drive from their town. One by one, they approached with apologies that felt both too little and too much, finally seeing Tom Richter not as a man with secrets, but as a hero who had chosen their small town as his home. The war was over. The hunt was over. And tomorrow the healing could begin. The morning sun painted Main Street in shades of gold and possibility as Tom Richter stood at his shop window, watching the town prepare for a ceremony he'd never wanted. Federal agents had worked through the night, transforming the quiet square into something that looked too important for a man who just wanted to fix cars. Frank Kowalski arrived with coffee and the only suit Tom had ever seen him wear, offering quiet companionship before the storm of recognition. Maya Santos followed, carrying a manila folder containing every draft of the article that had nearly destroyed them both. She came seeking absolution, destroying the false narrative she'd created in favor of a truth she was finally ready to tell. The ceremony itself unfolded with the precision of federal protocol. Senator William Bradley spoke of debt and gratitude, his son Marcus standing in crisp dress uniform as living proof of Tom's heroism. The Presidential Medal of Freedom felt heavier than expected when it settled around Tom's neck, not just ceremonial weight, but the accumulated mass of 3 years spent hiding from recognition he'd never wanted. When given the chance to speak, Tom looked out at faces he'd come to know through quiet transactions at his shop. He saw Karen Mitchell, tears streaming down her cheeks, and Chief Hayes standing at attention. He saw neighbors who had brought him casseroles and trusted him with their problems without knowing they were sheltering a decorated soldier. Tom's words came slowly, deliberately. He hadn't come to Millbrook to be a hero. He'd come to disappear. But the town had given him something unexpected. A home built not on his story, but on his usefulness. They'd needed someone to fix their cars and plow their snow, and he'd found purpose in that simple exchange. He addressed their collective guilt directly, absolving them of the suspicion that had driven recent events. Karen Mitchell had been protecting her neighbors, and that wasn't something requiring apology. She'd simply been protecting them from the wrong threat. The community's healthy skepticism had been reasonable. They'd just been looking in the wrong direction. The revelation that transformed the ceremony came when Tom acknowledged his contentment. Despite the secrecy and isolation, these had been the happiest 3 years of his adult life. Not because he was hiding, but because he was useful, because he had neighbors who cared enough to worry about him, even when their worry took the form of suspicion. When Frank Kowalski stepped forward to ask if he was staying, Tom's answer came without hesitation. He was staying if they'd have him. The applause that followed felt different. Not the formal recognition of ceremony, but the genuine welcome of a community embracing one of its own. As the crowd dispersed, people approached individually with handshakes, hugs, and words that carried the weight of genuine reconciliation. Children who had been taught to fear the strange mechanic now wanted to touch his metal, and he knelt to their level, explaining heroism in terms they could understand. Mayor Henley promised privacy protection, but Tom declined. He was done hiding. The story was out now, and he'd rather deal with attention than live like a ghost. The transformation was complete, from a man running from his past to one at peace with his story. Agent Chen's final visit carried the weight of true goodbye. No more check-ins, no more emergency protocols, no more living on the edge of flight. He was officially just Tom Richter, mechanic, citizen of Millbrook. The federal machinery that had protected him for 3 years was withdrawing, leaving him free to be whoever he chose to be. As evening settled over the town, Frank returned with bourbon and the comfortable silence of shared understanding. Two old soldiers who had found peace in an unexpected place, toasting not just freedom but the deeper satisfaction of coming home. Through his shop window, Tom could see the town settling into its evening routine, the same rhythms that had comforted him for 3 years. Now with the added comfort of belonging. The war was over. The hunt was over. The hiding was over. He was home.